I do have some years of experience in the theater, but I don't have years of experience as an activist. And so when Stephanie asked me to do this, I was quick to make that distinction. And it's a distinction that feels instructive to me and important to me. And so it's what I want to, some thoughts, the thoughts that I'm going to share with you right now are sort of about those two things. In the past couple of years, I've been asked, to give some speeches, and whenever I have to give a speech, I realize that in the theater, you have workshops and previews. I think you get my point. I don't need to go on about that, really. I'm pretty sure, relatively sure about what's in the first part of this speech. The second part, we're just going to take a leap, so we'll see. And part of that, of course, is because, we're just on this. Roller coaster seems too benign for the situation that we're in. And so, every day I would have more new thoughts that I tried to wrestle into a shape for you here tonight. I think because I have always been an out lesbian in my work, sometimes people conflate what I put on stage with activism, but I have always felt pretty clear that I'm not an activist. And I was just thinking today that part of the reason that was clear to me is that when I was starting out, I always sort of referred to myself as activist adjacent. And when I started out in New York, I was part of this downtown lesbian theater community at the Wow Cafe, which was actually part of a larger constellation of overlapping LGBT communities in the 80s and 90s, all of whom were forging culture and social and political progress on various fronts. I was in theater, of course. There were lesbian comics. There was a lesbian music scene. Of course, there was an academic front. Alison Bechdel was sort of her own little front with Dykes to Watch Out For. Legal rights, international human rights people were working on, and of course, AIDS was a central front. So my focus was on theater at the Wow Cafe and then other East Village clubs, and then little by little moving up as doors opened to larger and more mainstream stages. All of these groups came together every year at the Gay Pride Parade, which still exists, but it's so different, people know. And it's hard to describe now what the feeling was like in those years of, I worked as an office temp for 10 years, and what it felt like to walk past those buildings that I was working in, where I wasn't in the closet exactly, but the assumption was that everyone was straight, and sometimes I might challenge that, but often not, and one didn't know what the repercussions of coming out in a midtown law firm would be, and didn't necessarily feel pressing or worth it. And in my downtown life, I was living in a world where being out was taken for granted, this glorious place where I was taught to assume my own centrality, certainly in my own artistic voice. And so Gay Pride was the moment where these two worlds would meet, and it was such a heady experience to walk by these buildings in our, our vintage skirts and our Doc Martens and our black bras. We always took our shirts off, and we were always wearing black bras, and we'd sing songs about getting married, which seemed like purely hilarious whimsy at that time. My ex-girlfriend had a joke every single year that she would say, "Oh, I just went up to the anarchist groups. I like to go up to them every year and say, you guys were really organized this year. You really have." She used to say, "Oh, it just drives them crazy." One year, my parents marched with us, and when we passed the protesters who always stood in front of the St. Patrick's Cathedral, I don't know if I haven't been to the parade in a few years. I don't know if they're still there. When we passed the protesters, this woman yelled at my mother, "You sick fucking dyke! Why can't you get a man?" And my father just shrugged, One year, my friend Mo ran up to some woman on the sidelines, and she was like, "Happy Gay Pride!" And the woman looked at her and pointed to her underarms and said, "Shave!" I don't know what that was about. And one year, all the way down Fifth Avenue, this was our chant. What do we want? Provocative lesbian theater. When do we want it? Late September, early October. We knew we could feel that it's compelling, right? It was true. We could feel that we were forging a new path into the culture, but we could also see what the activists were doing. They were in the streets, and they were in the halls of the CDC, and they were in St. Patrick's Cathedral, disrupting and demanding immediate action and change on matters of life and death. So I was clear about that distinction at that point. People often talk to me about Fun Home's impact on the culture, but I know that Fun Home's successful run on Broadway wasn't a generator of cultural change. Rather, it was a marker of a cultural shift that had been painstakingly made by artists breaking new ground in the margins and activists strategically, tirelessly, and relentlessly pressing for social and political change. Thousands of activists over decades. We can only see what culture makes visible to us. These Broadway audiences might have seen they were thinking something new, but in fact, they had been primed to see that by these decades of culture and political work. The distinction between theater and activism feels important to me because I think conflating them diminishes both of them. Theater can be a tool of activism, but the aims are different. The aims of activism are immediate and specific. It's after targeted outcomes, specific changes to laws, policies, and systems, structural remedies to injustice. And theater, well, you know, theater people have always been trying to articulate the aims of theater since Aristotle. And you know, I could throw out, you know, it's a means for, you know, making visible the ineffable. It's a method for us to overcome the insularity of our individual consciousnesses. It's a way to imagine and model new paradigms for ourselves, you know, blah, blah, blah. Really, the point is that the fact that it's so hard to pin down and the fact that it's so clear what the aims of activism are, really, I think, make my point. I was thinking that if King Lear was a play that had been written to get inheritance laws for women changed, we would no longer know anything about King Lear. I want to say that although art and activism are not the same, I do believe that all art is political. For the purposes of this argument, I'm going to define political as having to do with the way resources are allocated across society. Healthcare, education, money, time, representation, narrative representation, and so on. In this country, identity, race, gender is a political factor because we have made those things a determinant of resource allocation. So using this definition, all plays are political. And there are two types of plays. Plays that have an overt concern with resource allocation, and those that are satisfied with the current resource allocation. One of the things plays can do for us is they teach us how to have empathy for fellow human beings. And we often say that we shouldn't judge our characters, and I think that's right. In a way, but I think that having empathy for humans doesn't mean actually having no moral judgment. It means, I think, making clear that people have volition, they make choices, they take actions, and those actions affect other people. We all have an effect on each other. We're all interconnected. And maybe this is where the morality of a play is located. A character does something. Their action has repercussions. Who is affected by that action and in what ways? Who and what is the playwright tracking? I think maybe the morality of a play is located in the playwright's map of consequences, of the consequences of the actions taken by her characters. how does a political play take on systemic bias or oppression? This is really tough and something that I think about a lot. Violent, repressive, or exploitative policies undertaken by governments and corporations are hard to see because there's never just one evil person pulling the strings. The way these systems work is responsibility is spread across bureaucracies or entire business sectors. The mortgage lending crisis, for instance. I believe, and you might agree, that there are criminals at the top who should be punished, but their crimes were actually carried out by thousands and thousands of people taking discrete actions that, looked at in a particular way, could be defended and are defended as each having a fairly benign, if not clearly positive purpose. To see the way this person's seemingly innocuous job is a vital part of a system that caused this person over here to lose their home, or this person over here to spend 25 years in prison, or this person over here to become addicted to opioids, or this person to not have mental health treatment. To see that connection, we actually need a very big lens. We need to be able to see the entire structure and how it operates, and that's very complicated. It's something that's easy to do in a book or a lecture or an article, but how does one do it in a play? An example of that I was thinking about today is Raisin in the Sun. This play is built on a map of structural racism. Hansberry takes structural racism as a given, and then she puts people who come from different points on that map together in scenes, and she shows us that structural racism is not an abstract idea. It's a reflection of people's actual lived experience. When Mr. Lindner from the Clybourne Park Improvements Association comes to offer the Youngers money not to move into that neighborhood, he thinks he's offering a pretty good deal and everybody will be better off. He says you can just go somewhere else and here's some money to make that possible. When the Youngers rebuff his offer, he's unsettled and he's ultimately enraged. He can't understand why. It's a win-win. He's laid it all out for them. He really wants to believe better of these people, but they refuse his help. And they insist on continuing down a path that, as he's made clear, is going to hurt everyone, including them. It is incomprehensible to him, this will to self-destruction. Worse than that, as he sees it, it's aggressive. He's explained it to them, and they well know that if they move in, things are going to get ugly. But it seems like they're just going to do it anyway. He thinks, who is the real victim in this situation? He hates to say it, but clearly it's him. What he feels in this scene is the mainstream point of view. It's the mainstream point of view right now. It's everywhere. All around us, we see policies being put forward that are constructed to further consolidate the ability of the powerful to control and subjugate others, and we see those policies described as win-win policies, good for everyone. Obviously, as I heard today on the radio, affirmative action has to go because it's another form of racism, and we all agree we're against racism. Obviously, people should have to work for their welfare benefits, because if they don't have to work for basic food and shelter, they might not work at all. Those who object to these policies are dismissed as aggressive, illogical, perversely self-destructive. The theater has a superpower. Hansberry used this superpower when she turned the lens and showed us these arguments being made by Lindner, but through the eyes of the Youngers. From their vantage point, Lindner's role as a willing cog in a vast and crushing system of housing discrimination becomes perfectly, lucidly clear. One of the issues that is on the mind of white writers right now, that white writers have a tremendous amount of anxiety about, is whether or not we can write people of color. I would like to say that no one cares what you write. You can write anything you want. What people care about is what gets produced. To talk about this, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit an article written by Yasmin Abdel-Magid, who's a writer responding to an infamous keynote address that the fiction writer, I took her name out of this. What's her name? Yeah, Lionel Shriver, right, gave a year and a half ago in Brisbane. And what she said was the reason people react, this is paraphrase, the reason people react when the white guy writes the story of a Nigerian woman is because the actual Nigerian woman can't get published or reviewed to begin with. People have an issue when a straight white woman writes the story of a queer indigenous man because when was the last time you heard a queer indigenous man tell his own story? When underrepresented groups are once again represented through a skewed and biased lens in a story that essentially reinforces the existing narrative, entrenching disadvantage that the writer has never experienced, people have a hard time with that. And the fact is that the vast majority of plays making it to our stages right now, if they show us the youngers at all, they show them to us through Lindner's eyes, not as people in their own right, but as obstacles along the path of the protagonist or servants to aid him in his path. Another article that has been very illuminating to me was also written in response to the Lionel Shriver speech by a white writer named Jess Rowe, who says, "I now realize something white writers learn almost by default. For a fiction writer to deny that fiction is in some way political, in the sense of existing in an inherently politicized world, is not only an act of bad faith, but a kind of artistic failure. How can we not, as writers, grasp that our own political existence, our own subjectivity, our citizenship, our racial and cultural identities, and the arguments of our time are not material for our art, that these things are, in some sense, not all part of one ongoing conversation?" For white writers who decide that they do want to write people of color, and I think that's what's implicit in this Jess Rowe piece. I think it's important to do that. We need to have a bigger view. We need to be part of that large, big ongoing conversation. These are some random thoughts, which, for what they're worth, about writing non-white characters. Everybody wants things for themselves. Every person does things all the time. Women do things, they have ideas, they take actions all the time. People of color have ideas and they do things all the time. If there were more productions of plays by women and people of color and differently abled people and deaf people and gender non-binary people and indigenous people, this would not be confusing to anyone. Because culture is what makes us visible to each other. A couple of years ago, I noticed a new genre of musical theater song in which women characters sang their authors' anxieties about this point. The authors seemed to know they were supposed to give their female characters something more to do than to be a faithful wife supplying the high notes. Beyond that, they were stumped, and so they wrote songs in which literally really sang, "How can I be useful? There's got to be something I can do." I don't know if you've ever met women, particularly wives and mothers, but I can't think of one I've ever met with a blank to-do list. Everybody has issues, but sitting around stumped about how they're going to make themselves useful is not most women's problem. A more familiar story would be, I've solved 20 problems already, while those guys and their plot think they're the only ones here. But I want to really round up this thinly veiled and cheap critique of other people's work by telling you a story about my own struggle with this, when we were working on Fun Home, and we were trying to write the character of Helen, it was Janine who had to push me to find a reason for Helen to want to stay in that marriage more than she was his wife. Being a wife is not a character trait. Being a wife in the 50s is not a character trait, or the 60s or the 70s. And so we really had to dig deep. I had to dig deep. I had to be challenged on this to say, what does she get? What does she, this woman, this specific woman, get out of this relationship with this man? All kinds of people are all kinds of people. You can be an idiot and be rich or poor. You can be a person who tends toward hubris and be rich or poor. You can occupy the most powerful position in the world and think of yourself as the most victimized. You can be a slave and have a keen understanding of the latent power in the symbiotic relationship between you and people who claim ownership of you. There's a lot of talk now about the power of narratives and stories. Every TED Talk, I think, talks about the power of narrative and stories. And stories are, of course, extremely powerful. We know that. But I think it's important for us to remember that not all narratives are true and not all narratives are good. We know this when we're looking at Fox News. It's more difficult to be rigorous about our own work. It's really hard to write a play. It's even harder to make sure it represents something true in the world. One place to look to investigate this problem is around the issue of volition. Do all of your characters have volition? If not, which characters are passive? Narratives in which only the protagonist has volition and everybody else is passive or only acting on to further the interests of the protagonist are one kind of problem. Narratives in which everyone has volition except a central passive protagonist is another kind of a problem. Often, this is the way we tell stories about our own lives, as passive while other people act on us. But like every other human, we're always making choices, and we always have volition. Today, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by Fred Hyatt, who was looking at a choice suddenly coming into focus for the many Americans who have been working for the Saudis in various capacities. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, has made no secret of the fact that he runs an authoritarian regime. American policy has long held that the benefits dealing with that regime outweigh the problems. And Hyatt discusses the choice now facing this small army of American retired generals, diplomats, intelligence experts, and others who work for MBS, who've been assuring themselves, as he says, this is a win-win situation. It's, yes, lucrative for them, but it's also enhancing mutual understanding with an important US ally and so forth. The editorial asks how the presumed assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, most likely at the behest of MBS, might change that equation for these people. He writes, how might, say, a retired Air Force colonel explain his work when his daughter asks, Daddy, why do you work for a murderer? Well, it helps to pay for your future college tuition, he might answer. And besides, I get to fly business class. Riyadh is no picnic, but they always spring for a couple of nights in a 5-star hotel in London or Abu Dhabi on the way over. And more important, if I don't do this job, someone else will. Hyatt goes on parsing this imagined colonel wrestling through this moral morass, through his pros and cons. When I read this op-ed today, the answer for me was clear. I would never, ever work as a consultant to a violent regime like Saudi Arabia. The key ingredient in my moral clarity, of course, is the fact that I am in no way either qualified or interested in taking such a job. The moral high ground for people who do those jobs should be taking is extremely clear to me. A moral crossroads in which the correct path is obvious, in which there's no risk to your comfort or status, is actually not a moral crossroads. I don't know what it is. I guess it's just driving on a well-marked road and then turning onto another well-marked road. An actual moral crossroads isn't well-marked, or more likely, The signs might all state clearly you should keep driving in this way, even if it means driving over bodies. This is the nature of a moral decision. Do you obey the signs as you have been taught to do from the time you were little? Or do you trust your gut, which is telling you you cannot drive over bodies? It's so confusing because everyone knows, you've been taught since you were little, that ignoring the signs leads to societal breakdown. Also, a whole line of cars is obeying the signs and they're driving over the bodies, so there's got to be a reason that they're there. It must be all right. It seems like it's causing suffering, but it couldn't be happening, right, unless there was a good reason for it. And now, a couple of the cars are starting to back up. They're trying to turn around, and it's creating a mess. It's creating a huge traffic jam, and people are honking, and people are getting incredibly angry. And now there's a problem most people can agree on. And the problem everyone can agree on was created by these disruptors. Let's think about what might lie ahead for the disruptors, for the people who saw those signs and said, what? No, I'm not going to drive over those bodies. Those people risk being called names, ridiculed, fined, arrested, beaten. They could lose their jobs. They could be tortured. They could be deported. They could be killed. This is the nature of a moral choice. Since the election, I have been thinking, picturing the nature of these choices, hoping that I will be strong enough to make the right choice. And I have to tell you, I have always thought of myself, and I have actually seen myself be the person who, in the lifeboat, when somebody has to get off or the boat will drown, I have this feeling, I have this fear that I'm the person who's like, throw the baby out. It's important to practice. It's important to understand the true nature of a moral choice, that there is sacrifice, there is discomfort, there is risk. Martin Luther King wrote in Letter from Birmingham Jail, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, his prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others." Like so many others, it was the 2016 elections that drew me into activism. The longtime organizer, L.A. Kaufman, in her new book, How to Read a Protest, The Art of Organizing and Resistance, writes, "It may be difficult to remember the climate of fear and paralysis that overtook many Americans in the wake of the 2016 election. Given the scale of calamity the country had experienced, the elevation to the presidency of a racist, misogynist, authoritarian buffoon who lost the popular vote and owed his election to factors that raised serious questions of legitimacy, the initial response was strikingly small in scale and muted in character. The direct bodily experience of assembling in large numbers and acting in concert broke the nationwide spell of fear and silence." Theater people live in a bubble. We spend our lives and our time creating worlds, imagining whole worlds. And in doing that, we often forget that there is an actual world filled with things that we don't know about. Thornton Wilder had served in the First World War, and he was in his 40s when the Second World War happened, and he enlisted in the army. He was asked about why he did this in the Paris Review, in an interview in the Paris Review, and he said, "One of the dangers of the American artist is that he finds himself almost exclusively thrown in with persons more or less in the arts. He lives among them, eats among them, quarrels with them, marries them. I have long felt that portraits of the non-artist in American literature reflect this pattern. The artist portrays a man in the street as he remembers him from childhood or as he copies him out of books. So one of the benefits of military service, one of them is being thrown into daily contact with non-artists, something a young American writer should consciously seek. My initial impulse, and an impulse I see in other theater artists, is to say, how do I fix this problem? But what quickly became apparent to me was that there were other people who actually knew things that I didn't know. One of the things that really struck me after the election was how there were all these organizations that I sort of knew about and had generally supported, and they were not unprepared for this election. They had been working in the trenches, many of them for decades, and they had a granular knowledge of what the Republicans were likely to do, and they had strategies already in place to push back. What they hadn't had before was our support or attention. When people rushed to the airports when the first travel ban was announced, it was not a miraculous burst of cultural telepathy. It was because of word traveling over networks that had been painstakingly built by activists. So, to other theater people just entering activism, I want to say to you, we do not need, and it will not be helpful for us to try to reinvent the wheel. We can put ourselves at the service of experienced activists. A question that I'm asked often, because I've gone into the street a lot, is, does marching make a difference? And when I'm asked this question, I often think about my friend Annie Jobst, who was half of the dance duo, the performance dance duo, Dance Noise. I was on a panel with her once many years ago, and someone asked her, do you consider yourself a feminist? And her answer, which was really the best answer I've ever heard to that question, was, of course I'm a feminist. What do I look like, a dildo? That's the kind of response that I feel like giving when people ask whether it's worthwhile to go into the street. Masha Gessen, who has been really one of my touchstone voices in these couple of years, says, autocracies work by plunging citizens into a state of low-level dread. Most of the powers commandeered by the autocrats are seated without a fight, and the power of the imagination, the claim to the past and the future, are the first to go. A person in a state of dread lives in a miserable forever present. A person in a state of dread is imminently controllable. The choice to protest, on the other hand, is the choice to take control of one's body, one's time, and one's words, and in doing so, reclaim the ability to see a future. L.A. Kaufman says, the work protests do often can't be seen in the moment. Their effects tend to be subtle, dispersed, and catalytic. There are occasions, of course, when you're destined to lose whatever it was you're fighting for, and a protest is just a cry of frustration. But other times, the arc of history does bend toward justice, and there are magical moments when, often quite suddenly, you win. Protesting is always an act of faith, a gamble that action might spark more action, that inspiration will travel in unpredictable ways, that taking a bold public stand will set new forces into motion, and that justice will prevail. Perhaps the biggest challenge that movements face is sustaining the hope that's required for people to keep taking action over time. So sometimes the most consequential way a mass protest can work is by changing the protesters themselves, giving them a taste of the collective power they need to stay in the fight. The election of Donald Trump felt to me like a bolt from the blue, although I know it could not have been. So much of the punditry earlier, particularly immediately after the election, but even still now, places the blame or the credit for Trump's presidency on the white working class. If the white working class all on its own had enough power to choose the president, wouldn't they be doing much better now than they're doing? If it was all about the white working class, why is Trump's cabinet made up of wall-to-wall billionaires? And why has the entire pro-big business Republican Party remade itself in his image? I can see that these things are happening. I can see that we are in the grip of a regime that is systematically tearing down the structures of American democracy as fast as it can and appears to be deliberately driving us hard in the directions of authoritarianism, Christofascism, white supremacy, kleptocracy. I don't know why. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined this moment. I couldn't have imagined this moment. And that tells me that my worldview was missing a lot of crucial information. It tells me that I must be part of the reason Trump is president. The fact that I didn't see this coming tells me that I wasn't paying attention to the right things, and I'm probably still not. In a way, in the same way that the presumed assassination of Jamal Khashoggi is a crystallizing event that might catalyze a moral reckoning for people who work in Saudi Arabia, so Trump's election was a crystallizing moment for me, and it catalyzed a reckoning with my own complicity. I was raised in a racially integrated neighborhood with daily conversations about the nuts and bolts of systemic housing discrimination. I was not unaware that theater is far from the inclusive community we say we want it to be, but it wasn't until after the 2016 election that I became aware of how incredibly often I've been sitting in all white or mostly white rooms, rehearsal rooms, tech tables, casting sessions, board meetings, marketing meetings, staff meetings, fundraising meetings, season planning meetings, press events. Sometimes I was aware of it, and sometimes I made generalized comments about it. But it's not until the last year or so that I've come to really understand that this imbalance is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It exists because people like me would rather believe it's a naturally occurring phenomenon than consider that it might be the result of our own self-reinforcing implicit bias, not someone else's, mine. And in order for me to change it, I've got to speak up, and I'll tell you, it's not that fun. The first time, it's generally fine. Everybody agrees. Everybody's for diversity. But when the diversity doesn't happen, and I continue to insist we have to try harder, we have to go again and look for people who may not be on our radar but are almost certainly out there, it's not that fun. It doesn't feel like the behavior of a likable, popular person, even though I'm nice, I think, when I'm doing it, and other people are nice while I'm doing it. It definitely involves pushing everyone in the room, including myself, out of our comfort zones. I do it because since the election, I've started to get a glimpse of my own part in maintaining the self-perpetuating loop of implicit bias. And the results of that bias are terrible. Children are being held right now in concentration camps on our border. People are being left homeless by storms, and no one is coming to help them. One thing that feels clear after the Kavanaugh fight is that no one will ever fight as hard for you as you will fight for yourself. Abortion access is never going to be a non-negotiable issue for men. Marriage equality is never going to be a non-negotiable issue for straight people. The deportation of black and brown people is never going to be a non-negotiable issue for white citizens. If we're going to push back against Trumpism, then we need people in every single institution who have a personal stake in these fights. In order to save ourselves, we must save each other.